Christ. I've been set free from drugs, alcohol, porn, sexual immorality, and vanity. Today I still struggle with religion and thinking I have to fit into a box to be accepted by God. This is my testimony from death to life. This is a story of the faithfulness of the Almighty. Jeremiah 1:5 says, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet of the nations." I was born in November of 1993. Shortly after my birth, my parents would divorce for the first time. In 1998, they remarried, and my sister was born in November of that year. When she was very young, they would divorce again, and I'm not entirely sure why. I do know that they both had their issues. My dad suffered from anger. My mother was an alcoholic. At 5 years old, I did not understand that they were living in the bondage of generational curses. The only thing I did know is that I loved both my mom and my dad. Exodus 25 says, "You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me." After their second divorce, we moved around a few times. My mom dated some men, but she fell in love with a man that had the same demons that she did. After several years, they bought a house, and we settled on the farm that my grandmother and grandfather owned. This is where so much of my childhood was spent. It wasn't new, but this is where I recall so much of the turmoil occurring because we spent most of our time there. I remember they would go to the bar, and I would just pray for her safety, even though I didn't really know God. I knew that He was real. When they would drink at home and fight, I would beg God to allow them both just to fall asleep before the fists would start flying. 14 years they were married, and my sister and I lived in constant fear. I knew on Fridays to have a bag packed so that I could escape over the hill to my grandmother's house. That was my safe haven. Aside from alcohol, he was also unfaithful. He crushed my mother deeply. This would cause my mom to constantly talk about killing herself. She would drink until she was belligerent. She would play sad music and cry. Of course, she did everything but leave. If he was home and not in jail or prison, as he often was, she would throw up everything he had ever done to hurt her, and then she'd end up in a chokehold or with a black eye. After 23 911 calls one year, the court decided they had to split up, and he went to prison again. As I grew up, I became entangled into sin in several different ways. I started with a boyfriend I had in 8th grade. I started to have sex, and I thought everything that I was doing was normal because everyone else was doing it. Nobody had ever explained the importance of covenant to me and what sex really meant, or the soul ties and the consequences that come with a promiscuous lifestyle. But they put me on birth control. I would drink occasionally from the time of 14 years old. I didn't really party, but if given the opportunity, I would drink. I had my license by the time I was 16, so I could drive anywhere I wanted. My mom worked night shift. She was a single mom, so it was easy for her to be too busy to really know where I was or to be concerned. When I was 16 years old, I met a girl online from a neighboring county, and soon after that, we were in a romantic relationship. I tried to hide it from my parents for a long time because I knew they wouldn't approve. But eventually, I told my mother that this is who I am, I'm a lesbian. My mom could deal with a lot and accept a lot of things from me, but that was not one of them. She flat out told me that she would not accept it in her home. All while the drinking and the violence was continuing, so I used this relationship as an escape. I had no idea that I was struggling with my identity and who I was created to be. I had already opened the doors to Satan. He had a foothold, and he just kept taking. This relationship was not just sinful in the nature of it being two girls, it was also very violent. It was full of jealousy, rage, and control. But I didn't even dislike it. I thought it was normal. And if I'm completely honest, I lived for the drama. I lived for the chaos. I was already wrapped up in so much bondage. The generational curses were coming down the pike, and I was living in them and coming into agreement with all of it. My dating life would remain a train wreck. Me and her would break up and fight, and I would find someone else for a few weeks. I was very promiscuous in high school, and every few months I would find the one. It was literally the definition of insanity. Around 17 years old, I got expelled from high school for an inappropriate picture of a girl that was going around from phone to phone. I was 1 month shy of being 18 years old, 1 month shy of having to register as a sex offender for a stupid picture of a girl that I didn't even know. Although my intentions were not malicious, my actions caused me to not walk across the stage with my graduating class. And I didn't want to admit it for a long time because I had so much pride. But that crushed me. I was mortified. I went to night school for a few weeks, and instead of completing it, I dropped out because guess what? I met a boy. He had dropped out a few years prior to me, and we talked and decided we'd just go get our GED. After hanging out with this guy for a very short time, I moved on from drinking occasionally, which I had done with my friends, to smoking weed. You know, the thing I swore I'd never do. 1 Timothy 6:9 says, "Those who want to get rich fall into temptation and trap into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction." I wasn't seeking richness in the sense of money, but in the sense of filling a large void that had been there since I could remember. So this guy would become my first husband. Exactly a week after we took our GED test, we'd get married. What started off as me occasionally smoking weed went to every day. Then it progressed to pills. It was anything we could get our hands on eventually because we were both hurting inside for different reasons. A month after marrying would be the first of many times he would cheat on me, and it wrecked my entire world. I hated myself so much at this point, but I was so deeply rooted in sin and bondage. May 5th, 2012, I found out I was pregnant, and my entire world changed. For me, the pregnancy changed everything. I stopped the drugs and drinking. This allowed me to see a little bit more clearly, and while I stopped, he did not. The cheating never stopped, but I never left. On October 23rd, I ended up in the hospital very sick. I was transferred to Ruby, where I would deliver a 4-pound, 8-ounce premature baby boy, Brody. He was my entire world. February 16th of 2013, my husband left me. I didn't have a car, I didn't have a job or a home. I lived with my mother and had nothing but a premature baby and no clue how to raise him. It hit me quickly. I had to figure out how to take care of my son and myself. I would wrestle this monster of my first marriage while finding comfort in anyone who would have me. I would leave Brody with my grandma and party. I would disappear in the middle of the night and not tell anybody where I was going. I was looking for love in all the wrong places. April 16th, 2014, I got legally divorced, but the soul tie kept us back and forth for nearly 10 years. I moved into subsidized housing. I got a job as a dental assistant. I was working, paying my bills with the assistance of the state. So I thought what I did in my time off was my business. I was dating people while also going back and forth between my ex-husband. This cycle was the definition of insanity, but again, I loved it. For the most part, I was doing good, or so I thought. I could live in this constant state of mayhem because it was all I knew. I was living my mother's life. Then one of the hardest days of my life came. I received a phone call late July that my mother had an incident at work and was on her way to the hospital. I prayed and prayed that week more than I'd ever prayed in my life. I didn't know God, but I needed him. But on August 4th, my mother passed away. After a week in the critical care, on the ventilator, and tons of prayers, she died anyways. I was so mad at the Lord for not answering the prayers that I prayed, even though I only prayed when I needed something. I was so upset with him because in my eyes, he had forsaken me. The one person that I knew loved me unconditionally, she was gone. At this point, my ex-husband and I were still trying to work things out, and we were on and off. He would be arrested for larceny at some point, and I wouldn't be able to see through my rose-colored glasses that he was secretly suffering from a drug addiction. After his first arrest, I lost my subsidized housing because he was on my lease. I moved in with my grandma, which made it easier to leave in the middle of the night. I now had a built-in babysitter. In 2017, I found the one again. I moved into an apartment with my boyfriend's mom. He didn't live there, though, because he was in prison. As you can probably tell, I had a type. While he was away in prison, though, things were tough. We fought often, and I couldn't handle all the emotional turmoil. So I met another guy who swept me off my feet, and he said all the right things. I moved in with him and his mother. One night while partying together, he told me he used methamphetamine because he wanted to be open and honest, which to me was one of the harder drugs, and I was taken back, but I liked him so much that it didn't run me off. After a few weeks of seeing him, I decided to try this drug that he desperately loved. Up until this point, I considered myself a dabbler. I dabbled in drugs, and I was able to put down anything that I picked up. This was one of the biggest mistakes of my life. This was something I could not put down easily. I fell into this hole of depression and disgust with myself. My ex-husband was in jail for a drug charge, and I wasn't far behind him. I signed my son over temporarily to my sister-in-law so that child services wouldn't take him. Her and her husband were such a blessing in disguise, but I was as low as I'd ever been. I was mad at the world and myself. One night while lying in bed at this man's house, I prayed a prayer in my head. I told God if he would just get me out of there, I would never come back. My spirit was so downcast. I was sure that even if God had heard me, he ignored me. I was sure of all people he could hear from, I was not the one he wanted to hear from. But he did hear me. A few days later, my grandma told me she would allow me to move back in, but I could never go back. 2 Samuel 22:7 says, "In my distress I called to the Lord. I called out to my God. From his temple he heard my voice. My cry came to his ears." I bent and broke that rule a little bit that my grandma gave me, but her grace was a gift, as were her prayers. This is my grandma that taught me what I knew about God. She was in church every Wednesday and Sunday. She made her beliefs known. She took me to vacation Bible school as a child, and as I got older, she called me out on my crap. She's the reason I knew God was real. 2 Timothy 1:5 says, "I am reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your grandmother Eunice, and now I am sure dwells in you as well." I didn't know it, but this was the start of what God was going to do. This was the beginning of my redemption story. He heard me that day, and though it took me several years to reflect on it and see that, today I know that he heard my heart cry out to him in desperation. I wish this was the part where I tell you everything was awesome. I got clean, and I dedicated everything to the Lord, but it's not. The boyfriend that was in prison came home, and I went running to him, begging for his forgiveness for leaving while he was in prison, and everything was great at first, but it soon became very volatile and violent. A few short months after his return home, I became pregnant. I was excited, I was happy, and I was convinced this is going to fix everything. But one night, he strangled me over something we were fighting about, and I realized then that things were never going to get fixed. My ex-husband was due to be released, and I wanted to try and work things out with him. But I knew I couldn't do that if I was pregnant with another man's baby. My life was falling apart without my drug of choice. A few days later, I was convinced that the only logical thing to do was have an abortion, which I did. To this day, I have never told him because he would have killed me. I was so hopeless. Although I wasn't using my drug of choice, I was still using marijuana and alcohol to cope. I thought if God had not completely quit listening to me and blotted me out of the book of life yet, this is what did it. My ex-husband came home. He relapsed once and went to a 28-day program. When he came home from that program, though, he was different. He had an encounter with Jesus, and he wanted to tell me all about it. I cannot tell you how annoyed I was that after everything we had been through, he was the one getting his life together before me. But this was a radical turning point for me because although our relationship did not work out, he was the reason I returned to Christ fully. He sowed a seed, and his testimony was simply a miracle. The man that didn't even believe in God months ago was a radical believer in Jesus and wanted to tell everyone, even me. And that was when I decided to put all my eggs in the God basket. I quit using all drugs and really started obeying the convictions of the Holy Spirit. Kind of. I started attending church and meetings. Now, during this time, I was unable to discern the difference between relationship and religion. I was not fully sanctified overnight, believe it or not. And neither was he. This strained our relationship, and he told me he didn't want to be with me. I was devastated, and I couldn't believe after everything this was how it ended. I asked God several Sundays in a row to make him love me, fix me. Whatever you need to change in me, Lord, change me. But one Sunday, I knelt at that altar and I said, God, do whatever you want. If you do not restore this relationship, I am okay with that. That next Thursday, at a meeting, in walked some tall, tattooed hunk of a man from the Lazarus House of the 180 Center of Buchanan. That was Zach McKissick. Zach caused me to get real with myself. He had so much recovery and he had gone through the drug court program, he didn't have time for the crap. He made me start my clean time counter over from the day that I actually gave up on mine and mood-altering substances. Talk about a pride check. Zach was God's will. Zach was the man I needed and prayed for. Zach was the man the Lord wanted to bless me with, but I had to let go of my past. I had to be willing to surrender it. As of today, we have been married 3 years. I have never begged Zach to love me. I have never begged Zach not to hit me. I have never had to explain the small things to Zach in the hopes that he wouldn't walk out and quit on us. I've never begged Zach to communicate with me or love our son and daughter. Zach works and provides for his family. I can never tell you, Zachary, how incredibly grateful I am for you. Zach was also who introduced me to Celebrate Recovery. I'd never really been to a Christ-centered program, but it changed my life. This was where I realized that although I was not using drugs, I had a lot of junk to get rid of and heal from. I still had so many hurts, habits, and hang-ups that I had to let Jesus deal with. Voluntarily submit to any and all changes God wants to make in my life and humbly ask him to remove my character defects. There were a lot. There still are a lot. Happy are those whose greatest desire is to do what God requires. Matthew 5:6. Today I stand before you delivered from so many things: drugs, alcohol, depression, porn, sexual sin, abortion, and so many more. Jesus broke generational curses off of me and the generations to come after me. Those curses went back many generations, but they ended with this one. And God says that the blessing will go on for thousands. My kids will not have to live in the bondage that I did, in Jesus' name. Joel 1:3, tell your children about it, and let your children tell their children, and their children the next generation. Joel 2:25, I will restore to you the years that the swarming locusts have eaten, the hopper, the destroyer, and the cutter. Today, I am a mother to 2 children. I am a nurse in the CCU. I'm involved in the church. Let me have a key. Thank you guys for letting me share.